All right, guys, we're going to move into the presidency of John Adams, and almost immediately you could tell things would be different.
At 61, Adams brought an impressive background to the presidency. He had helped write the Declaration of Independence. He had negotiated the treaty that ended the Revolution. And Adams had been a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He had the resume, but lacked one essential quality.
His great problem, of course, was he wasn't George Washington. Washington was a majestic, literally larger-than-life figure who looked like he was born to wear a military uniform. John Adams was a short, squat, balding, rather unprepossessing New England lawyer.
Some people referred to him as his rotundity. He was not a dashing figure. Even when he got dressed up for events, he might put on a sword. He looked kind of pedestrian.
The second president had more than just image problems. In retaliation for Washington's proclamation of neutrality, France had seized more than 300 American merchant ships, a disaster for the American economy that drove insurance rates on shipping up 500%. Adams sent diplomat James Monroe to Paris to negotiate. The response he got enraged the nation.
French were looking for a bribe, and they were unwilling at that time to negotiate, and they wanted a little something to grease the palms in order to open up the negotiations.
Americans, they saw it as an insult to their sovereignty, an insult to their independence. They were not being treated properly, and it became an enormous issue. And people wanted to declare war on France.
Adams, however, knew that with an army of just a few thousand troops and a navy of only 25 vessels, the new nation was no match for the might of the French.
He said, let's not rush into this. Let's not go off half-cocked and do something that we can't really handle.
So Adams enters into his presidency with this huge issue with France. He had sent a delegation to negotiate with the French who were seizing these American ships, but they demanded a bribe to even speak with their foreign minister. And rather than railing against it, Adams published the report referring to them as agents X, Y, and Z, and that's how it gets its name. There were a lot of people who wanted Adams to go to war with France, and there was this undeclared war between the United States and France on the Atlantic Ocean, where ships were being seized by the French. American ships with their limited firepower were fighting back. But Adams lets cooler heads prevail, and in 1800, the French agreed to stop seizing American ships after he sends another delegation.
Many saw Adams as weak and timid for not answering this challenge to American pride. He attempted to rebound and show his tougher side by signing the Alien and Sedition Acts.
We were afraid of aliens, foreigners coming in and somehow or other taking control. The logic behind that being the government's so new and so fragile and so unproven that if people start to say nasty things about the government and its leaders, it'll collapse.
And so anybody who spoke ill of the government could be arrested, fined, and some people were, some newspaper editors especially.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were just a terrible law that basically, trampled on the Constitution. And the ink was still wet, basically saying freedom, well, it's a nice idea on that piece of paper, but we're not really going to do that here in the Adams administration.
The Alien and Sedition Acts doomed Adams' presidency.
The problem for Adams, and where this really hurts his presidency, is that during that undeclared war, he signed two laws restricting American freedoms, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. The Alien Act allowed the president to deport non-citizens who criticized the government, and the Sedition Act allowed the president to arrest citizens who criticized the government. In fact, 10 people were arrested under the Sedition Act, mostly Democratic Republicans and newspaper writers. And this, Adams agonized over signing it, and it truly hurt his presidency and really kind of sank his efforts at leaving a lasting legacy. And part of that criticism came from his own vice president. The Democratic Republicans said those Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. And so Thomas Jefferson, Vice President of the United States, and James Madison wrote these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions opposing the Sedition Acts. They said the laws were unconstitutional and that states could nullify federal laws they disagreed with. And that nullification issue is going to be big. We're going to come back to that throughout this whole first semester. But no other states supported Virginia and Kentucky. And eventually when Jefferson becomes President of the United States, and actually Madison will become his Secretary of State, the laws will eventually be allowed to disappear from the books, or at least have no effect anymore. But it was a signal that there was a divide in this nation between what the Federalists wanted and what the Democratic Republicans wanted. This issue of parties is now starting to split the country apart.
1800. It was a cold, cloudy Saturday in November when President John Adams, more than 3.5 years into his term, arrived in Washington, D.C. to take the keys to his new home. Tucked behind a woody knoll, the president's house was a grand mansion. Unlike the White House of today, there were no porticos, no balconies, but with 3 floors, the building had dozens of rooms and had cost the equivalent of $3 million in today's dollars to build.
People picture Washington the way it is today, and they picture it with these monumental buildings and this sense of authority. But Washington was a foggy bottom. It was a swamp. There are accounts of wolves wandering around in the streets, and it was all heavily wooded, and sometimes people would get lost.
But Adams' time in the president's new home was destined to be short.
And so in 1800, Adams is up for re-election, and Jefferson, rather than remaining as a vice president, chooses to run against him. And Jefferson wins in this election in 1800, and he ends up tying, of all people, his running mate, Aaron Burr. And that created a bit of a constitutional issue, because it's like, well, how do we decide which one is president, which one is vice president? And even though Adams lost and leaves this bad legacy, Jefferson ends up becoming president through the efforts of his own rival, Alexander Hamilton, who said some pretty nasty things about Aaron Burr, which leads to a duel between the two of them in which Burr ends up shooting Alexander Hamilton. But Jefferson is the first president to be sworn in Washington, D.C., as Adams was the first president to live in Washington, D.C. He walked to the Capitol and used his speech to bring the country together. Thanks, guys, for paying attention. Hopefully you took good notes.